In an English inn during the early 1800s, a dog padded in with a saddle strapped to its back. The dog was alone, and a fairly ridiculous sight. The saddle was a better fit to a pony than a dog, but close inspection revealed a note attached to the saddle addressed to the keeper of any inn the dog visited on his journey. It requested the dog be fed and provided shelter before being sent on. This dog was called Carlo, and when he got to the inn, he was halfway through his lonely journey from London to Wales. Carlo was a drover's dog, a footnote in an ancient profession whose book is now firmly closed. But to understand how Carlo came to be in that predicament, let's open that book again and have a peek through the pages. Medieval and early modern Wales was far poorer than England. It's too mountainous to farm efficiently, and had the small but notable problem of being constantly invaded by various English kings. Edward I might be hated by the Scots, but the Welsh have no fan clubs dedicated to him either. But there were two things the Welsh had that kept their economy above water. One was wool, and the other was cattle. On the surface, droving is a simple profession. You take animals from one place where prices are low to another place where prices are high, and the difference is your profit. It should be one of the simplest things in the world, but like everything else that sounds simple, it becomes complicated when anyone tries to apply the theory to reality. The first problem the Welsh drover had was distance. The walk from Anglesey in northwest Wales to the markets of Smithfield in London took between 3 to 4 weeks. It involved crossing the perilous Menai Straits, navigating a treacherous mountain pass with terrible visibility, and eventually contending with the much rougher roads across the border in England. But the drovers found a way to overcome all these hurdles. At the Menai Straits, the best crossing point was found, a cheery sounding place called Gallows Point, and during the crossing ropes were hooped over the horns of any cattle who looked like they may be in danger of floating away. Scots pines, tall straight trees, were planted along the mountain pass. They stood out on the landscape despite the low visibility and allowed the drivers to safely navigate by them. But the English roads were a different matter. Up until this point, the journey had been on relatively soft ground, but this would no longer be the case. It became necessary for the cattle to be shod, and it's safe to say that this was an undertaking. Cattle shoes are not like horseshoes. They come in 2 parts as 2 C's instead of 1, meaning that each cow needed 8 shoes. The largest drove we are aware of had over 1,000 cattle, requiring more than 8,000 shoes. These were forged during the winter, so the drovers didn't need to wait around for them to be made, but it did take time to put them on the cattle. Luckily, there were a number of blacksmiths who set themselves up near the drovers' route, earning themselves 10 pence for each cattle shod. Unfortunately, drovers were not only in charge of cattle. On their journey eastwards, they would have picked up both pigs and geese, which were also endangered by the rough roads. The pigs were fitted with shoes made of leather and alder, which doesn't sound like too much of a bad deal. The geese had a harder time. Hot, liquid tar was poured into a compound of sawdust and sand, and the geese were forced to walk through it. It covered their feet, and as it cooled, it hardened into a pad, which allowed them to weather the journey along the roads to London. On the subject of non-cattle goods, the drovers didn't just take animals. Whilst they were still in Wales, they picked up other goods which could be sold in the London markets, investing their wealth from previous droves into local Welsh communities. Locals, especially local lords, might give the drovers money to pay off debts they'd racked up in England, and in 1636, the drovers were even entrusted to collect the ship tax in Denbigh on their way to London. It was at this point, stacked with goods and mountains of coins, that they stepped across the border of Wales into highwayman country. Droves were usually pretty safe. Even disregarding the huge number of cattle who were in danger of stampeding at any moment, especially if some would-be robber attempted to discharge a pistol next to them, there was also the sheer number of people. Dozens of drovers accompanied a drove, some of whom would be riding a horse, and many of whom would also be armed in anticipation of the ambitious highwayman. Other people also came along. Strong young men headed to England in the hopes of getting a job, or to take a ship in London to some destination abroad they hoped would improve their fortunes. Dozens of dogs of various breeds, including both collies and corgis, yes, corgis were used as cattle dogs, also accompanied the drove. However, not everyone stuck with the pack. It was the job of the head drover to ride half an hour ahead of the drove, ringing a bell and letting locals know to get their own livestock out of the way. If a farmer's cattle got mixed up into the drove, the prospect of retrieving them was far from certain. There is one story of a head drover who was stopped by a pistol-wielding highwayman whilst far out in front of the pack. Luckily, the drover was mounted, and when the highwayman approached, he kicked the man in the chest, whipped out his own pistol, and ended the highwayman's career. Highwaymanning was always a bit of a high-risk occupation. To prevent the need of carrying too much coin, banks were also established along the route that served drovers, allowing them to pass credit up and down the line. The most famous of these was the Black Ox Bank. It had a small black ox on the banknotes it issued, and they were eventually sold to Lloyds, but they were so trusted locally that even Lloyds allowed them to keep using the black ox on their banknotes. It only finally shut its doors in 2019. As the drove progressed, the drovers would often stop at inns which had fields available for them to keep their livestock. For some years, the innkeepers would charge half a penny per creature left in the field, and so these fields often retained their name, Halfpenny Field. I've seen it said that drovers would plant Scots pines outside of such places as a sort of rating system. 1 pine was okay, 2 was better than okay, and 3 was best. And presumably 10 meant the innkeeper had cottoned on and was trying to pull a fast one. Many of these inns have also retained names relating to the drover trade. There are lots of Drovers Inns and Drovers Arms amongst others, and these aren't the only landmarks that have kept their names. Often roads themselves are named after their historical use by drovers. Welsh Way, Welsh Road, Bullock Lane, etc. Drovers may be gone and all but forgotten, but their presence is still marked across the British landscape. Eventually, the drover would reach the fields around London. Here, they would graze their stock in drover-owned fields for a few weeks, hoping to put back on much of the body weight that had been lost on the journey. When sufficiently fattened up, the cattle and other livestock could be sold. But here is the darker side of droving. The cruelty displayed by the drovers to their animals resulted in calls for laws to be put in place to prevent it. In 1789, the London authorities made an order to prevent the cruelty, but it seemed to have little effect. As far as most drovers were concerned, it seems, the animals were there to serve the purposes of the drover. Their treatment of the animals was neither here nor there, and this went just as much for dogs as it did for cattle. Which brings us back to Carlo. There is a tale of a drover called Clough. In the early 1800s, he was convinced by a customer in London to sell his pony as well as his livestock. Clough agreed and decided to head back to Wales by coach. His dog, he decided, would have to make the journey back on its own. So he strapped his sole pony's saddle to the dog and attached to it the note mentioned at the beginning of this video. Patting the dog, he gave the simple command, "Home." It said the dog travelled back, staying at each inn they had visited along the way before getting back home a week later. Is this possible? Dogs have been known to return home from great distances, and whilst the drove would travel at an average of 2 miles an hour, 8 hours a day, not including weekends, a dog on its own could travel faster and further in a day without feeling the need to pause for the Sabbath. So, possible? Yes. Probable? Well, what do you think?